and welcome to another episode of Aileen's Arcane Archive. I'm your pajamas archivist, Louise, one half of the Ailene Lynn Ray writing team. Today we are going to be talking about David Green. And I've had several people recommend David Green's books to me, and he is a prolific writer. He has quite a few sci-fi fantasy books out there. But the one that caught my attention the most was Magic, Maps, and Mischief, his newest book that is out right now. And it is a cozy neurodivergent adventure. And one of the reasons why this caught my attention was because of the subtitle there, a cozy neurodivergent adventure, because I happen to live in a neurodivergent household. So my oldest son was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, which is now functioning autism, when he was very young. And when we were going through the process of getting him diagnosed, my husband realized that he also had Asperger's syndrome or functioning autism. Now, my husband was, Daryl, my co-author, was also diagnosed ADD when he was younger. But it wasn't until we went through the whole process of testing my son that he realized that he had a lot of the same challenges. Couldn't read facial expressions or understand emotions in other people. And a lot of other challenges that come with being on the autism spectrum. Then my middle son was diagnosed with ADHD and atypical dyslexia. And then my daughter was diagnosed with ADHD and social autism. And then late in life, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So all of us understand what it means to be atypical, I guess, would be a good way to put it. Neurodivergent. Thinking a little bit different than what is considered the norm. And we understand what it takes to have your own little tics and tricks and things like that to calm ourselves down or to help us to cope. Now, David Green himself is on the autism spectrum. He is autistic. And it's one thing to be autistic, and it's another thing to write a character that is relatable and someone that you can sympathize with. And David Green has done a fantastic job with his character. And so let's go ahead and I will introduce you to Gretton of Willow, who is David Green's neurodivergent character in here. And he is someone that you might be able to relate to as well. So how far would you go to discover your heart's desire? Gretton of Willow is in a spot of bother. Caught in the act while escorting a family of elves to safety, Gretton flees for greener pastures with only his scant magic and brilliant mind to his name. And a question, the question, what is your heart's desire? A lifelong outsider, Gretton sets out to uncover what lies at the center of his heart. Is it adopting a tawny owl, owning his own map shop, forging a found family with others as similarly scorned as himself? The possibilities are endless. Determined to put his marvelous mind to the task, Gretton discovers a way to reveal anyone's heart's desire, but not everyone's longings are as pure as his. So go ahead, sit back, find yourself your comfy spot and your beverage of choice. And let's get into Magic, Maps, and Mischief by David Green. Chapter 1. The Wrong Place at the Right Time. In all of Gretton's 111 years, a single question had never quite gripped him like the one currently making a racket between his ears. More often than not, Certain intriguing queries had the habit of burrowing themselves into his remarkable mind, but none sank into his soul as this one had just now. Her words echoed in his mind as the alluring thought gnawed at him, and distracted Gretton completely from the rather dangerous situation he found himself in. He peered at the cowering group of elves before him, their backs pressed against the dusty stone wall of the basement. Gretton had been bundled into the cramped space to search it, and quite against his will, too. "I'm sorry. What a curious question." The old man pulled at one of his earlobes, a habitual gesture. "Can you ask it again?" Up above, footsteps hammered, dislodging all manner of dirt and cobwebs from the faded mahogany support beams overhead. Gretton belonged to an organization of mages known as Sparkers, and together with prosperous city guards, they conducted regular night raids throughout the sprawling port settlement. Their goal? To hunt down any elves not already fastened in chains. The only good elves happened to be dead ones, said many in Haltveld. The mighty island nation despised its elven underclass. Others approved of them being forced into slavery or locked away in the numerous walled slums of the nation's cities. For most in the upper reaches of society, the coin to be made from the elves' plight proved a fine and plentiful gift indeed. Gretton didn't agree. The constant persecution of anyone made him sad, and pity flowed along with spiky injustice in his veins at the sight of the family before him. "I know you're a Sparker," one of the elves snarled, backing up against the wall but still defiant. Older than the rest, with chipped teeth bared, she stood in front of the group of children, her arms spread wide in protection. "I can tell what you are, even if you don't wear the bright robes of your kind. Those eyes of yours give you away. You're not taking my children and putting them in chains, old man." Well, as Gretton would insist, the term old was subjective in the case of Sparkers. He was certainly aged in the manner of non-magical humans, but for a mage, he swam somewhere in his late middle years. Gretton blinked, then shuddered. "Your children? Why in Haltveld would I take your children? Or any elves for that matter. Not to mention putting them in chains. How barbaric, and a horror that anyone would do such a thing. I have never supported this policy and am not here by choice, believe me." The floorboards above them creaked. The old man fidgeted, hands by his sides, calming himself. In his time, the scholar had picked up many ways to soothe his nerves, and touching the soft, ink-stained skin of his index finger seemed to ease his confusion. He didn't enjoy raids. Gretton never had. But when he'd stumbled upon an active sortie and his superiors recognized him as a Sparker, he'd been drafted to help. He couldn't really disobey direct orders, even though he wanted nothing more than to do so. Conflicting thoughts jostled in Gretton's mind, each aiming to knock aside the question the elf had posed earlier. He'd found elves. Protocol dictated he alert others conducting the raid. The Empire commanded the Sparkers to protect its interests, and he had his orders. Deep in thought, he rubbed at his index fingers more vigorously. A mother and her 3 children trembled before him. Not dangerous warriors or rogue mages, a family. Gretton didn't have one himself, and hadn't for a very long time. But being honest, he rather envied anyone with one, knowing a thing or two about families despite his lack of his own. After all, he knew a lot about a great many things, and a thing or two about many other subjects besides. "I don't believe you. Because you're a Sparker," the elven woman hissed, backing into her children a little more and pulling the venerable mage from his tumultuous ruminations. "It's what your kind does to us, humans and sorcerers both. You hate us all, and won't rest until we're dead, or worse, until we're slaves or thrown in the slums." Gretton tilted his head to the side. "I do not hate you. To be honest, I always strive to be. I have always rather enjoyed elven company. Though opportunities to experience it now are few and far between. Though I don't suppose I need to tell you that. Now, going back to the question you asked. You don't hate us, then?" the woman asked quickly. "No," the old man answered. "Of course not." "Will you let us go, then?" the elf asked, licking her lips. The floorboards groaned again from the pressure of heavy boots, and muffled, pleading shouts drifted down dark basement stairs. The house appeared to be a warren of hidden elves, a bounty for the Empire. "Can you help us escape from this raid, please?" Deep lines ate into Gretton's wrinkled brow. A question. Not the question. But not the one that had gripped his mind. But given the circumstances, a perfectly logical and important one. Ah, the raid. Yes, a nasty bit of business. If I had known the city guard were launching one tonight, I would have stayed at a village outside of the city and arrived here tomorrow. Though I hurried over the last few miles from Springhaven. Morningvale, perhaps. They have lovely flowers there. Can't you open a portal to send us away? Pretend you never saw us. We won't cause any trouble. He shook his head. A portal? A spark does not work like that. And even if it did, I imagined I wouldn't be capable of such a feat. Healing and experiments with the energies of the world are my particular talents. A portal? What a fine thing that would be. No, I cannot, even though I wish I could. And the same goes for leaving you here and turning a blind eye. If I do, surely someone else will come down here and find you. But seeing you all like this, he bit his lower lip. It's not right. No, it is not. Gretton frowned. Despite being a sparker, he'd never shown any real aptitude for magic aside from the most rudimentary of spells. He'd shown little proficiency for battle either. Ooh, I have a kitty interrupting. We will need to pause for a moment. Okay, now that we have had the kitty all streaked away, let's see where we were at. Gretton frowned. Despite being born a sparker, he'd never shown any real aptitude for magic aside from the most rudimentary of spells. He'd shown little proficiency for battle either. As such, the Order of Sparkers and Haltfeld's Master of War saw little need for him. The happy result being Gretton rarely found himself in the midst of elven raids or any other nasty business. The powers that be were content to leave him to his studies and numerous absorbing pastimes. Sadly, his luck hadn't traveled with him to prosper. Members of his order had spotted him entering the city, even though he left his bright sparker robes in his university rooms in Haltfeld's capital, Springhaven, to avoid attention. He had been seeking a little peace and more than a little quiet on his travels. Gretton rubbed at the side of his nose, the touch of his index fingers losing its power to soothe. He'd probably smeared a glob of ink there, a common occurrence. Dabbling with ink, discovering the substance's properties and shades delighted the scholar, much as discovering an exotic whiskey or a previously unknown sweetmeat fascinated others. You mean you're not part of the raid? The elf asked. Really? This isn't a game of yours to torment me. She tried to peer into his bright blue eyes. Like all sparkers, Gretton's were more radiant than those of the non-magical, but he refused to meet her gaze and fixed his attention on the tip of her nose instead. He and eye contact had long since given up on one another. My elven friend, I may be a sparker, but my passions lie in scholarly knowledge, rich brandy and fine wines, uncovering hidden truths and telling the correct history of our nation. The latter is a task of increasing difficulty, let me tell you. Not raids, Gretton smiled. And maps. I do love maps. It is why I came to Prosper in the first place. To add a map of the place to my collection, or perhaps create one of my own instead while I am here. You know, I have never quite found a map of the city that is accurate enough and satisfies my— Yes, yes, the elf cried, then held out a hand for silence. The floorboard right above them had let out a wail. Only a cat whose tail found itself beneath a boot could have matched it. Gretton clamped a hand over his mouth and begged his nostrils to breathe in silence. The footsteps moved away. After a moment, the elven woman moved closer, her stare clamped, boring into the ceiling. Will you help us? Like I said, we only search for a heart's desire. Surely you can understand that. Gretton's age-lined face brightened. Finally, this was the question. Yes, your heart's desire. You asked me if I had ever chased after mine. What a curious question indeed. My heart's desire. What is my— The elf's hands fastened on Gretton's robes, and she yanked him forward until the tips of their noses almost touched. And the old man blinked, his fingers clicking together with frantic speed in the cramped space between his chest and the elven woman. What's your name, Sparker? She hissed. He swallowed. Gretton of Willow. Some of my work on the nature of spark and Haltfeld's history is widely published. You may have heard of me? A chuckle of disbelief bubbled from her lips. Elves aren't really welcome in the bookstores, Gretton, so I haven't, no. But I'll sing your praises to the trees and talk to you about your heart's desire for as long as you want if you help us escape. The elf's eyes suddenly shone with unshed tears. Look, I'm desperate. All my children have are me, and I'll die before I'm taken a slave. Do you understand? Please. If you meant us harm or ill, you'd have shouted up those stairs the moment you spotted us, but you didn't. A shuddering sigh tore through her throat. Help us. Don't leave us here for someone else to find. The forlorn elf pulled at the front of his robes one last time, then let go. Her children rushed forward, grabbing at her legs, their weeping silent. Gretton stilled his fidgeting and studied them. The 3 younglings were nothing but a collection of rags, filthy skin and protruding bones, but a fierce, defiant light glinted in their tear-flooded stares. Their mother clutched at them and tried to soothe them with hushed murmurs. They all clung to their last sliver of hope, even with the house above them filled with enemy sparkers and city guards, and that sliver was Gretton. A man who spent his time organizing his quills in alphabetical order according to the name of the bird who provided the feather. A man who always ate his food from least favorite to favorite at mealtimes, so he could leave the best morsel until last. A man who now couldn't shake a single question from his mind, even when surrounded by peril and danger. Gretton smiled at the children's fierce protector. Asking her the question, he fancied, was appropriate at last. If he would offer his assistance, he needed to know the answer. "What is your heart's desire?" he asked in a whisper, but even still his voice cracked at the edges. The elf glanced at him, and for the briefest of moments Gretton met her piercing regard. To be free. She wiped at her eyes, her grime-thick cheeks cleaned by her tears. To be free from a nation where people like me can't just be, and not just for me either. The elf hugged her children tightly. For them, I need my babies to have a different life to mine. One where we're free to live under the stars and moon in peace. A place to exist and be. Gretton understood the sentiment all too well, though such places had proved bitterly few and increasingly far between. You are all alone? Slavers took my wife last year and we fled with just our lives. We've been hiding ever since. Gretton's small hands balled themselves into tight fists. If I can get you out of here, where would you go? The elf licked her lips. The docks? Friendly ship captains smuggle elves to Velen. I know where to go and who to ask, but we haven't the coin for. I have money, the old sparker interrupted, patting at a heavy pouch fastened to his belt. It tinkled with modest wealth. The docks, you say? They are not far from here, Sparker. I know. Gretton looked away and nodded. Drawing on his reserves of will, he pushed the nagging question from his mind again. But a question never failed to knot Gretton until he fed it an answer. Ever since the elf had asked him to name his heart's desire, as she'd fought for her own freedom, he'd been pondering this vital question. Now it burned in his mind, taking on the status of 1,000 questions. His heart's desire. No one had ever asked him. And Gretton had never thought about it. Not really. The old man filled his time with hobbies and intrigues he enjoyed, but was there a singular thing he desired more than anything else? And if so, how would he know? Again he pushed his urge to delve into the depths of his mind away, and focused on the matter at hand. With a glance over his shoulder at the stairs, the old man turned back to the elf and smiled. What is your name? Lura, she answered. Stay here, Lura. Keep silent and wait for my call. A sparker is meant to help, to heal, not to spread fear. Gretton turned back to the stairs. And if you believe in Ross, or in Janna, or in any of the old elven gods, pray to them. For himself, Gretton didn't hold any belief, but he didn't see the harm in anyone else doing so, especially not in the predicament they found themselves in. He excelled at many things, but not at lying. Never that, and lies of the most excellent and cunning kind would be needed if the family of elves were to escape the chains waiting for them. Gretton hurried up the stairs, his heart running a race in his slender chest. Looking over his shoulder, the shadows had swallowed Lura and her children from sight by the time he reached the simple oak door leading to the 4-story house's main floor. Thuds and cries echoed from behind it, thuds of boots and fists, cries of alarm, pain, desperation, and fear. He pressed his hand against the door, his fingers stained with ink, swallowed, then pushed it open. Gretton! The barked shout roared from elsewhere. Gretton couldn't place it due to the barrage of shouting, the blur of bodies he experienced when emerging into the hallway. Not a quarter of an hour earlier, the old sparker had found the corridor wide, the ceiling at a pleasing height above his head, and the artwork hanging from the walls tasteful, rolling hills, beautiful buildings, and benevolent portraits with warm smiles welcoming him. Now he stood in a sea of mayhem. Soldiers ran past him, almost barging him aside in the narrow space. Bellows echoed around the cramped walls, engulfing him. from the running soldiers dragging crying elves and booming from other rooms in the house. The ceiling now dropped altogether too low and seemed to almost press on top of his gray-streaked hair. The rolling hills in the artwork now appeared patched and brown, the searing towers macabre and smothered in darkness, and the smiles and glares cast toward him from the portraits were mocking, seeing too much of his secrets and plans. Gretton staggered into the corridor and slammed the cellar door behind him. He leaned against it, covering his ears and screwing his eyes tight. My heart's desire, what is my heart's desire? The question flooded his mind once more. A reflex, a carriage to carry him away from the overwhelming stress of reality. I need to be away from here, no doubt, but what about after that? Even with his ears covered, boisterous surges of noise, created by a multitude of bodies and voices slammed into him, muffled now, but still an endless, insistent wave. Smells assaulted his delicate nose, sweat, blood, tears, desperation and excitement both. Even with his eyes fastened tight, his senses still betrayed him. Gretton's resolve was beaten down by a world not built for him. A place to just be had eluded him all his days. So as it sometimes did, his remarkable mind took him back to a place of safety, when the vast uncontrollable world around him proved just too much. In the forced darkness of his inner vision, a rolled-up piece of paper appeared, torn and frayed at the edges. Well worn, like Gretton himself, it unfurled itself within his mind, the parchment crinkled but pleasingly blank, alluring and filled with possibilities. Scratches echoed on parchment, the comforting scrape of a quill on hungry paper creating a barrier against the sound elsewhere, and on the parchment, ink spread. Across the well-worn but potential-filled parchment, the lines of the island nation of Haltfelt appeared in precise detail. The ink outlined its spread from north to south and east to west. The main cities appeared first. The capital, Springhaven, grew from the waiting western coast. Then his former home, the city of Willow, rose in the Midlands. Sea's Keep and Gallivan's Seat soon followed, and the harbor settlement of Adras came next, with the southern municipalities not far behind. Prosper, Temecht, Lyra. Once present, the invisible quill brought the rivers to life, the waterways always the old man's favorite to etch. Ah, yes. A smile spread across Gretton's lips as the exercise calmed his mind. That is better. Much better. The map's scope grew further, and land appeared beyond Haltfelt's eastern sea. Octeria's shoreline took shape, as did Velen's. Gretton frowned. Velen? A land he'd seldom visited, and no one visited the unnamed places beyond it. His maps of Velen in those regions were lacking in detail. Even as mountains, roads, towns, forests, and hamlets covered Haltfelt and Octeria, Velen remained blank, and the unknown stretches beyond it were indistinct and smothered with fog. I would very much like to see those lands for myself. His scowl lifted, even though the minutiae remained lacking in his mind map. Perhaps that is my heart's... Gretton! Another bellow tore through the work of art he'd been creating in his mind, and it disintegrated. With it went his sense of peace as rough hands grabbed and shook his thin shoulders. Snap out of it and report, or I'll throw you aside and see what's below myself, Gretton. The old man's eyes snapped open, and he stared up at the red face of Tulum Spen, a sparker, the leader of the raid and Gretton's superior. His fingers found the side of his nose, and he rubbed at it with untold vigor. An audible gasp was the only sound Gretton made as he stared at a birthmark on Tulum Spen's dangerously crimson face, a curious blemish resembling the shape of Velen's coastline. At least, in the literal face of impending ire and peril, Gretton had geography to comfort him. So that was Chapter 1 of Magic, Maps, and Mischief by David Green. It is a cozy, neurodivergent adventure. If this sounds like something that you want to delve into and find your own possibilities in this lovely character, I invite you to go and get a copy for yourself. We'll have all of the details in the details below in the video. I thank you for joining me today. If you like what you hear, I invite you to like and subscribe to our channel. It would help us out a lot. And so until next time, I would like you to remember that your life is a story, so go out and live it.